Good day, I'm John Fernandez. Welcome to eNewsline Live from AACSB's World Headquarters in Tampa, Florida. Today's topic of discussion will focus on a skill that educators have been battling for years to develop among their students, critical thinking. Some firmly believe that critical thinking and effective problem solving are the most important skills that an individual should possess upon completion of higher study. We expect those running and working for major companies and businesses to be well-rounded, critical thinkers. But are business schools doing enough to equip students with the knowledge and tools to be just that once they leave college and set out to the job world? With me here today is Jackson Nickerson, Professor of Organization and Strategy, Brookings non-resident Senior Scholar in Governance Studies, an Associate Dean and Director of Brookings Executive Education at the Olin Business School at Washington University in St. Louis. He is widely regarded as one of the experts in teaching critical thinking to business students. Jackson has been heavily involved with AACSB's Curriculum Development Series and redesigning the MBA Symposium, where he has shared his experience in developing to build the critical thinking at Olin Initiative. Olin Business School is also the recipient of the 2011 MBA Roundtable Innovator Award, which recognized the school for its approach to integrating critical thinking into its curriculum and impacting student success in filling this gap. We are delighted to have Professor Nickerson join us today to discuss this very important area in management education. Jackson, welcome to E&L.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you.
And a shout out to all our friends in St. Louis, where we were for 55 years. So we remember St. Louis fondly.
Oh, thank you.
Our first question, the importance of teaching college students, especially business students, to be better critical thinkers has been a hot topic over the past several years. It seems as though there are many different definitions for critical thinking. As an expert in this area, what do you consider critical thinking to be and to entail?
Well, thank you for the question. In my view, there are really two branches of critical thinking. One branch focuses on the notion of logic. It's what you'd get in a course from your philosophy department. A not B and C is not D. The other branch is really focused on overcoming thinking biases, overcoming thinking traps, so that one can comprehensively formulate the problem. Where the former is focusing on logical fallacies, the latter is focusing on how you can comprehensively formulate a problem so you can solve the right problem the first time.
We make a lot of type 2 errors.
Yes, indeed.
What do you think the emphasis on critical thinking is being placed, or why in the spotlight now? Is this a skill that individuals need more in the present-day business world than in the past?
Several years ago, I had the opportunity to be the facilitator for a conversation between students and 3 leading executives. And I asked all the executives the exact same question you just asked me. And what was interesting is they all gave me the same answer, which was, compared to 10 years ago, what students need now more than ever before is critical thinking. Why that happens is not quite clear, but I have 2 ideas. One is the pace of business, the globalization of business has changed, and solving the wrong problem is more costly than it was before. But there's been one other major change, and that is the internet. I used to teach incoming freshman students years ago, and they would come in and you'd ask a question, they would dig into it. But today it's different. The first thing they do is they get out their smartphone or their tablet and they type into Google the question. They come up with the answer and they hand it to you. And to some extent, I fear that the internet has created and socialized a culture among students which undermines critical thinking and focuses more on looking up the right question and reporting it without thinking about what it means or what the real question is.
Technology, the enabler and the enigma, both. As emphasized in a 2011 Carnegie report, Rethinking Undergraduate Business Education, we know this one well, liberal learning for the profession. how much would you say the lack of a liberal arts foundation in business curriculum is to account for inadequate critical thinking and problem-solving skills among business students?
Well, this is a fascinating question, and I think it's difficult to come up with a precise answer. My view largely is that a liberal arts curriculum is a fabulous foundation for a business curriculum. However, a business curriculum is also a fabulous foundation for liberal arts. I see them going hand in hand. It's important to recognize that critical thinking, particularly around inquiry and problem formulation, varies by domain. So even if liberal arts is doing a fantastic job in terms of instilling critical thinking skills in their students, it's not necessarily the perfect match into business, and vice versa. I think both liberal arts and business students do have these issues when it comes to using the internet and the cultural change. Both curriculums are affected by it.
Yeah. It seems to me, especially at the MBA level or specialized masters, got a bit of a challenge in addressing liberal arts education. In the course of the undergraduate program, there is sufficient time to, I think, do a good job, an undergraduate business education program. But the master's degree level, well, time's a bit tight. So do you have any suggestions for those that are coming not of a liberal arts background or an undergraduate business education that are coming into a specialized master's or MBA programs, how they would round out their liberal education?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have great advice for you. It's difficult for the students alone to learn how to improve their critical thinking unless they've had some initial training and education about the processes of critical thinking and how to reflect and improve those critical thinking. If the faculty and the programs aren't helping them out, there are very few other resources they can turn to advance their own problem formulation skills.
Yeah. Well, everyone should learn their reading, writing, and arithmetic, right?
And thinking.
And thinking, yes. We'll get. All right. Could you briefly describe the critical thinking at Olin Initiative? How and why did it come about, and what are the major objectives? How does it differ from other schools and that have also taken on the charge to making critical thinking an important component of business education?
Well, that's a big question. I'll do the best I can. It actually started in 2006 when my dean asked me to chair a committee to look at a problem he was having. Many recruiters had commented to him that our students were not good in communicating, and they weren't very good analytically. So I was asked with a group of faculty and administrators to dig in to figure out what the problem was. And initially, you might imagine how people responded. Well, let's create a course on communications. And some people suggested that we double our curriculum in terms of finance and accounting and shrink everything else in order to add the analytics. But what we discovered was a different root problem. The root problem is that our students weren't very good at critical thinking, and in particular, they weren't good at figuring out what the real problem was. That ultimately led to the launch of an initiative, where now when students come to the business school, MBA students in particular, after their first hour on campus, we launch into a critical thinking course. We also have a second course available to them. We've integrated the elements of critical thinking throughout our core, and in fact, over the 2 years. So it's not just a single course solution, it's become part of the lifeblood of our programs. And it's not just in the courses, we do extracurricular activities. For example, last year I debated the president of the MBA program on critical thinking, where we debated about different ways to formulate issues as opposed to come up with answers. So the idea is to focus on problem formulation in a comprehensive way, and that's different from the way other schools have implemented critical thinking. They tend to focus more on the logical fallacies and the logic as opposed to the problem formulation. And it's this formulation area where we've really focused.
Interesting. From your observation, do certain undergraduate majors stand out as being consistently better at developing critical thinking skills than others?
Well, I can't say I have any hard and fast data on this. What I can say is that it is human nature for people to jump to a solution. And jumping to a solution really causes people's ego to jump in and stimulates other biases, whether it's anchoring or framing or confirmation bias or self-justification or self-interest, and that's true across all the different programs. Because different domains use inquiry different ways and critical thinking differently, it's not clear to me that one is better or worse than the other. They're different, but they all suffer from these biases that get in the way of problem formulation.
We all love our ideas, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Business is often regarded as very much a nuts and bolts field of study, and business faculty are often the product of a business education themselves. Do you think faculty also need to be educated in becoming better critical thinkers before expecting them to teach this to their students? What advice would you share with them and administrators for being better prepared and incorporating critical thinking components into the curriculum? I find this interesting also in the context of our traditional PhD programs, which are in fact very cross-examining and deliberative of findings, but I'd like to hear your answer to the question.
Well, it's fascinating. There's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that faculty, having gone through a PhD program, hopefully have been trained in critical thinking. Not so much formally saying this is critical thinking, but in terms of the way in which they've been developed by their advisors in coming up with the research topic. So in many ways, faculty tend to be good at critical thinking. But the area of inquiry is one where it takes a long, long time to develop a dissertation or research paper. The bad news is when they get into class, if everyone has their own style of critical thinking, it's difficult to reinforce either a particular process or a set of processes to help students enhance their critical thinking. At Olin, we provided training activities to train all of our faculty. All new faculty go through a critical thinking training process. All of our administrators, from the dean down to our general services staff, have gone through a critical thinking training so that it weaves into the entire culture. And to the extent that you can get all the faculty to have a common definition of critical thinking, it allows you to reinforce the same ideas and ideals throughout the entire program.
Interesting. Is critical thinking something that needs to be developed predominantly at the undergraduate level? Interesting. In other words, is it too late once students reach the graduate or MBA level?
Well, I have some great news for you. And the great news is that it's never too late. And in some ways, the older you are and more experienced you are in the workforce in the world, the more impactful learning just a few basic tips and tricks and processes are. For example, I teach a program, a non-degreed program to executives, and we have one day in February and one day in March. That gives them a month to go back to the office and try it out. And the stories we get of how they've transformed their thinking and leadership is really traumatic. In fact, I just taught a course to a group of folks from the VA. And that evening, they were on the phone talking to their staff back in the home office. And the next day, they reported how simply by following some simple processes, they reformulated the problem in a more comprehensive way and broke through what was a barrier. That signals to me that in many ways, the more experienced you are, the easier it is to recognize the benefit from changing the way in which you inquire about issues.
Interesting. Olin Business School places emphasis on a problem solving, specifically on the ability to formulate and solve the right strategic problem the first time. A little bit of quality is free there. In a world where we increasingly expect to have answers quickly and readily at hand, how does the problem-solving process come into play?
Well, it turns out that it's more important now than before. If we need quick answers, but we end up solving the wrong problem, we often don't realize it until after we've gone through the effort of solving it, implementing it, trying it out. Not only does that incur costs, but it causes people to be cynical. There is a common mistake that people believe formulating a problem takes weeks, months. And what we've discovered is that using some basic processes, even taking an extra 15 minutes, an hour, if you can solve the right problem the first time, it allows you to save all that effort, it allows you to build a positive culture, and I think now more than ever it can be a source of competitive advantage for firms if they have a common approach within their organization.
We're moving along very well. Before we go to the audience questions, I'd like to go back to question 4, because when we were there, it was a bit unsure if we'd covered as much as I had thought. I'm going to reread it, but then let's. From your observations, what are some of the major ways that business schools fail to develop these important critical thinking skills and problem solving in students? I wanted to take that a little beyond it and to say that I'm not sure about how broadly we've embraced critical skills as a core part of any business curriculum, undergraduate or graduate level, and then adding to that the context of the global workplace, that complexity. So do you have anything more to add about the breadth of schools covering critical thinking, and then that element of building someone ready to go anywhere, anytime to add value?
Another complex question. So let me take it in different pieces. First of all, let's talk a little bit about how we teach business curriculum. All too often, we identify a problem for students, and then we provide them with some tools and techniques for solving that problem. A great illustration is in finance. If you're thinking about buying a replacement piece of equipment, we teach students to create a cash flow and then work out the net present value. So we give them a problem and we give them that solution. If you look in finance and marketing and operations, in HR and strategy and accounting, we have these very narrowly defined problems that we give them and a set of solutions. So you have siloed information on partial questions with partial answers. And we're really not encouraging them to formulate the problem in a comprehensive way for themselves. Then the students graduate, they go out in the real world, and what do they get confronted with? They get confronted with wicked, complex, ill-structured problems for which the formulation is not initially clear. There's very little we do in business schools, in my opinion, to give students the repeated practice for tackling and structuring wicked problems. Once you comprehensively formulate it, you've structured it. Once you've structured it, then it becomes a lot easier to figure out what tools match up. So I think there's a fundamental weakness in much of our curriculum in terms of giving students processes and lots of practice for structuring these wicked problems.
Yeah.
When you think about on the global dimension, you'll find that different cultures have different approaches for inquiry. And that makes it a little bit more difficult for a global leader to go into any location and understand and apply a process that would enable a group of people to come up with a comprehensively and well-formulated issue.
Yeah. It's a tougher environment for new graduates now. I go back to when I graduated in 1975 and went to work for Exxon Company USA. We're talking about the perfect command control environment of supervisory mentorship that was there as a support system for the neophytes like myself. So, but the world moves more slowly, and actually those organizations had competitive challenges long term. But then in the 80s and 90s, we went through first retrenching, delayering, right-sizing, business process reengineering, and new graduates have to come out without that infrastructure of mentorship. So I think that's part of the challenge for new graduates now too. But what are your thoughts?
Well, what it sounds like to me is the students have to come out and be ready to rock and roll.
I do.
In order to rock and roll, you need to be able to read the music and play the music. One thing that we've tried to do at the Olin School to account for this is that critical thinking is in part an individual activity, but it's also a collective activity. And so it's important for students to learn how to facilitate meetings, to engage in problem formulation, and to keep people from jumping to the solution. The number one issue in business, I think, is that the natural human reaction is to be a problem solver. But problem solvers get in the way of solving problems because they get locked into those solutions. So it's vital for students to come out of a program, at least with the capability of facilitating conversations among others, We found that to have a tremendous impact with our students, particularly in their summer internships, where they can demonstrate they've learned those skills.
Well, you mentioned earlier about when a student has a question, natural thing is to Google. It's become an important verb, maybe the most important verb on earth. And I think of another one. My 12-year-old wants an iPhone 5 because he wants to ask Siri questions. Now we're beyond even typing the question in, but to asking this machine that apologizes apparently for inappropriate answers, very polite. But how do these, whether it's Google or Wikipedia or Ask Siri, and how do you think these particular, let's call them assets, can be helpful for students used the right way?
Fascinating question. I think these assets like Siri, like Google, are extraordinarily helpful, particularly on the problem-solving side of the coin. But they are disastrous on the problem formulation side of the coin. In order to solve or formulate problems comprehensively, you really have to walk in a mile in somebody else's shoes. But you have to have enough trust and relationship to borrow their shoes to do that walking. And Google can't do that, and Siri can't do that. And having them understand how to engage with others, how to build that trust, how to probe and understand all these different perspectives really is not advanced through some sort of electronic mediation. It's still person to person.
When it comes down, there's no real shortcuts. That's what's important. All right. Well, we have questions from our audience, and this should take us in a slightly different direction. What evidence do you have that this approach to critical thinking, I'm speaking about the Olin, I assume, actually leads to higher performance in students? That's kind of broadly defined, but you can take it anywhere you'd like.
Sure. Well, understanding how an initiative maps to performance is important, but often difficult. We've evaluated the initiative, the critical thinking at Olin Initiative in 3 ways. First of all, we engage in a lot of peer and self-assessment. And we can assess over a series of assignments how the student's ability to formulate a case before solving it evolves. And we have some pretty good evidence to show very quickly, once you go through and develop some basic processes, some basic intellectual standards, and help them reflect, that very quickly they can improve their problem formulation. So that's one piece of evidence. A second piece of evidence is that our summer interns, we used to get somewhere around a 21, 22, 23% conversion rate. That is, 23% of the students, the MBA students, would get full-time job offers from their summer internship. What they now go in and do, which they didn't before they get an assignment and solve the problem. Now they get an assignment and they first try to formulate it comprehensively to make sure they're solving the right problem. And very frequently they find out that the problem they've been given isn't necessarily the real problem. Once they engage the stakeholders, reformulate the problem, reach consensus on it, usually takes 3 or 4 weeks. Many of them are given full-time job offers then. And in fact, our success rate has gone from 22, 23% to 42, 43% over the past 5 years. So that's an indicator that employers are reacting very favorably to what the students are bringing to their summer internships. The third piece of evidence is that our recruiters, who you may recall I said 6 or 7 years ago said our students weren't that analytic and weren't good communicators, now report that our students are fantastic communicators and great with analytics. And if you look at our employment statistics, 90 days after graduation, 6 years ago, we were in the middle of the top 50 pack. The past 3 years, we've been vying for number 1 or number 2 in 90-day employment statistics. Another piece of evidence is to suggest that the processes we're teaching the students, this initiative, is having a real impact for them.
Well, I think you found the golden goose, that you're going to receive a lot of calls on how you did that. It's important to all schools. Another question from the audience. A viewer from Mexico asks, is the duty of corporations to teach critical thinking to employees when the country where its offices are located has an educational system which does not provide for such training or skill development?
A fascinating question. The key word in that question, if I remember correctly, is duty. Do they have a duty? Is that an ethical duty or a moral duty? And I'd like to flip that to a different word. Is it in their best interest to do so? And to the extent that solving the right problems the first time either expands demand for your products, lowers costs, maybe allows you to enhance and increase employment, then it's probably in the best interest of the organizations to do so.
It is so. How do the areas of problem formulation and critical thinking relate to leadership? What is the link among these three important topics?
This question is something that I've been working on quite a bit the past year. Through my activities with Brookings Executive Education in Washington, D.C., which is largely focused on government executives, we've been developing and designing a leadership development curriculum. We call it Leading Thinking. Competencies focus on behaviors, which is the standard approach to leadership development. We're focusing on leading thinking. And this notion of thinking is critical to strategic thinking. Critical thinking is at the heart of it, leading change, and even innovation. But we don't organize and teach processes and programs around leading thinking. We're still a bit in the grips of the behavioralist revolution that's focusing on behaviors. Not to say that's wrong, I think that's necessary, but it may not be sufficient in order to reach the highest levels of leadership. So we've been designing curriculum that is really at its core is this idea of problem formulation, where a leader is engaging in conversations to help the entire organization formulate the right problem comprehensively, not to convince them that the leader has the right problem, but for collectively identifying what that real problem is. Because if everyone agrees to what the problem is, then everyone's going to be interested and can evaluate a solution. And if everyone's solution, then it's very likely to get implemented. So I actually think this idea of critical thinking, problem formulation, has the potential to be a very core, but currently missing element of leadership.
When you're talking about leadership for Olin grads, how do you address the sort of the elephant in the room, which is the emotional quotient, the students' readiness to operate in their groups and effectively influence others?
It's funny, in our slides, when we teach critical thinking, we do have an elephant in the room. We have an actual elephant, and we have various pictures around it. The key insight that was surprising for me personally, I was an engineer in a prior life. And now that I look back upon my engineering days, I see how bad a critical thinker I really was. And even now, I continue to get better, but I can't say that I'm perfect. The key thing goes back to this notion of people jumping to a solution. If you're in a meeting, and I'm sure the deans and faculty who are listening to this program can relate to this, if you're in a meeting and you're asked to tackle an issue, within moments, someone is going to throw out a solution. And then one of three things happens. Either everyone becomes a devil's advocate in the room and attacks the idea, and that person learns again never to throw out an idea. Or if it's the big dog in the room, everyone says, hey, that's a great idea, let's go do it. Or other people throw out competing ideas, and there's all this conflict between competing solutions. And then there's the meeting after the meeting to build the coalitions to see which solution wins. The point is this: once you throw out a solution before you've formulated the problem, your ego kicks in. And it stimulates biases around anchoring, around framing, around confirmation. All these different biases, in my mind, are related to this ego. And so the thing that we focus on with our students is, let's put off problem solving. Let's even put off figuring out the root cause until we identify all the related symptoms. And we have evidence to verify that they're correlated. Then and only then move on to root causes, not looking at solutions yet. So we understand all the root causes that can be driving these symptoms. Then and only then do we push on to solutions, because being a problem solver, throwing out that solution, undermines critical thinking.
Yeah, so identifying the alternatives. Well, have you noticed among your international students whether an individual's cultural background has a significant effect on how they solve problems and think critically?
if I'm going to put on my academic researcher hat, use the word significant, so I have to put up a lot of caveats,
Yes.
which just my personal viewpoint, it's quite interesting. I find that at our school, the students from India seem to be the most interested in critical thinking and improving their critical thinking. The students from Japan find the processes that we educate our students with to be more natural and common. They're used to it in their culture. I find that Chinese students perhaps have some of the greatest challenge because their educational approach and the thinking that they've developed is different from what we've been advocating. So there are variations that I've personally observed by nationality. I'm not sure it's quite culture because, of course, there are different cultures in each one of those nations. But there does seem to be some consistent heterogeneity.
Interesting, because you didn't refer to Americans to any great extent, and it is difficult to say what the American culture is in its origins of ethnicities. But is there anything that you can say about some of the strengths of American students or areas where they're particularly at risk at jumping to conclusions too quickly?
Well, there's a good and a bad news in that. Let me start with the bad and move to the good. The bad is American students very frequently will jump to the solution. Not quite a John Wayne attitude, but it's this idea that problem solving is greatly appreciated, and they're viewed as problem solvers, so they jump right in and say, here's the solution. And because of that, they tend to get locked in and biased and not really solve the right problem. Where they are extraordinarily strong is once you lay out an approach to facilitation and how to manage processes, they are particularly adept at creating a good team. They're particularly adept at going out and having conversations. They understand the nuances and subtleties of language a little bit more easily than non-native speakers. And so they have some strengths once they go through the program.
Sounds like AACSB employees. Have you noticed among your international students, well, I think that we've covered this one, that's the final one. But I guess before we end, I'd like to just say something that is indicative of forming critical thinking when we didn't know that critical thinking was an objective. When I left school in 1975, I became an internal auditor. You'd say, now, is that someone that simply counts? But it was really an environment where you evaluated operations and you made suggestions for improvement, very much less on the financial end, which was more external auditing. You could not be in a better, I would say even contentious, devil advocacy position as when you presented new ideas to an existing operation in a stoic organization and all the individuals thought through your idea and told you what was wrong with it. So that I thought was, I didn't realize it, but internal auditing was an early on way of building critical thinking. So those of you that consider internal auditing, you're not just bean counters.
One thing I'd like to mention is that we've written a bunch of case studies, and we have PowerPoint slides for classes. We've created a little booklet for students. We have some other materials to help schools adopt critical thinking. And all they need to do is send an email to criticalthinking@olin.wustl.edu or me, and we'll give you access to the website. Some of the materials are free. The rest of them are very nominal, low cost, and it provides guides for how schools and programs can adopt critical thinking for their own students.
I don't know if our audience is tired or because you've answered every question so thoroughly, but we seem to be stuck on the fourth question. I'm going to take that as a signal that there aren't any more. What I would like you to say is something about your experience in working with other academic professionals, particularly in higher education and particularly in business, towards developing their critical thinking skills. I know that you're very active, a core member of the critical thinking seminar team. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, there may be many out there that want to increase their skills that are at the academic side.
Great question. Well, there are a few ways I can respond to this. First of all, I do teach for AACSB, a one-day critical thinking course in which we not only go over the 4 different elements of critical thinking, but we talk about how you can lead change in your organization to implement it. And it's not really the standard leading change approach because, well, academic institutions are a little different. So that's one real great opportunity. We've also been doing some things volunteering with PhD students from different schools, where we invite them to Olin and we explain how understanding critical thinking can actually accelerate the development of their dissertation, and especially as junior faculty, how it can accelerate their research writing and acceptance of papers, and those are things that I'm very happy to share.
Well, thank you, Jackson. Wonderful answers to a wonderfully exciting topic, and I know you're going to get significant follow-up on this. For those of you that have very good ears, there seems to be a storm brewing, and I'm glad we're in a dome because we're not getting wet, but probably in the interest of our continued broadcast here, we should end at this time. I want to thank you, our viewing global audience, for joining us in this very interesting discussion on critical thinking's place in management education, its critical place, and how business schools can address this need among their students. Please mark your calendars for the next broadcast of ENL, which is scheduled for November 6th. Andy Policano, Dean of the Paul Merage School of Business at the University of California, Irvine, and co-author of the book Public No More, A New Path to Excellence for America's Public Universities, will discuss the pressing issue of the financial health of business schools in higher education. And I'd also mention that although the focus is on the public sector, that the challenges are consistent for schools anywhere and for whatever any model of funding. Be sure to visit our website for further information on this episode on critical thinking, our past episodes, and subsequent episodes of eNewsline Live. Thank you, and have a great day.